Welcome to the Houston Texans Daily Fantasy Team Preview. I'm Jason Gilbo. With me is Russell Clay. Taking a look at the Texans, which was basically the DeAndre Hopkins show last year. This year they have a few additions. You have Lamar Miller there now. You have a Will Fuller, who's interesting as a first-round pick. I'm intrigued with this offense just because I think there's a lot of question marks still, and especially I think the biggest one is Brock Osweiler.
Yes, absolutely. We don't know what we're going to get from him, but as we saw last year, Bill O'Brien can kind of make it work with whatever quarterback he has. And in terms of DeAndre Hopkins, his target shares it's going to be there. It's not going to be 192 targets again, but it's going to be high enough to where I don't think we're worried about him from a week-to-week basis and getting enough volume. He's going to be that high-end wide receiver one. We've kind of looked at last year and kind of look to this year.
Yeah, definitely agree. I mean, I do expect a knockback in targets just because there's a little more surrounding effort as there wasn't really last year. But obviously, as you mentioned, I mean, a high tier one wide receiver once again. 12 touchdowns for Hopkins last year. I mean, he got most of his production in really the first half of the season, kind of trended a little bit downwards as the season went on. 12 touchdowns, I think that's another doable number for him. But it's obviously, I think that's his ceiling. I think 10-9 is probably more realistic.
Yeah, I'd go 8 to 10 as probably his realistic range outcomes. But yeah, 10 to 12 probably where his ceiling lands somewhere. Obviously, we've seen him be a dominant goal line threat. So that's nice. But the big topic of discussion this offseason has sort of been those secondary receiving options off of him. Obviously, they draft Will Fuller in the first round, speedster out of Notre Dame with some pretty awesome production for a deep threat. He got a lot of volume, over 20 yards per reception, and also caught quite a few touchdowns. I believed he had like 15 in his junior season. So that's a really promising thing when you kind of add all the things up, and he's pretty much checks across the board other than maybe his weight. But he can definitely step in from year one and be that deep threat. Another guy they're looking for to emerge is Jalen Strong, who was a third-round pick last year out of Arizona State. He's kind of a very similar, very productive college player, very consistent. He lost a lot of weight. He's a good athlete, down to 217 after he was around 230 last year. So I think those two are really the ones where we're going to be looking at for tournaments, and maybe one of them emerges as a flex option every week or something like that. But I think it's really between those two who sort of emerges as the third sort of banana in that offense behind Hopkins and obviously the new acquisition, Lamar Miller.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as a Notre Dame fan, I watched a lot of Will Fuller during his time with the Irish and always was a big fan. And I'm hoping they use him in a similar role, just being that down-the-field threat. And obviously, If you play college football DFS, you probably know Jalen Strong and his production already in those late West Coast games. There is a lot of potential here in the receiving core, and I'm with you that as far as GPPs go, there is going to be some solid production out of Will Fuller, and if Strong emerges on a week-to-week basis, where I think one of those guys does hit more often than not. I am kind of high on those two, just because Hopkins is still going to take a lot of focus away from them, and especially if they can get a consistent running game going with Miller, and not necessarily high volume, but enough efficiency where he can take the edge off of really that passing game in general.
For sure. And again, we're not looking for an Anquan Bolden, Larry Fitzgerald combination. We're just looking for someone to be relevant on the other side of Hopkins. Obviously, last year it was Cecil Shorts and Nate Washington really combining for less yards than Hopkins got. So they barely hit 1,000 yards together, and that was the second and third options in the offense there in the receiving game. So it was a mess. I think it gets a lot better this year, and I actually think the offense just even with Brock Osweiler there, who I'm not very confident in, I think it just gets better all around. His pieces around him get a lot better.
Yeah, definitely. We can talk about Osweiler. I mean, what do you expect out of him as far as DFS goes? I mean, is he going to be a GPP target for you still, or is he just kind of be a wait and see approach?
So you mentioned college football. I'm a big college football guy. And when Bill O'Brien was at Penn State, he made this man named Christian Hackenberg into the next Joe Montana prospect. And then he left, and Christian Hackenberg was just literally awful. And I mean, we saw last year what he did with Brian Hoyer, which I was really impressed with. And we've just seen him be consistently good with quarterbacks and developing him. That's kind of like his calling card. So while I'm not a big fan of Osweiler, I'm wondering how much of a bump we should give him just for being with Bill O'Brien. I think that gives a lot of stability to a young quarterback. So I'm kind of in an every week type of way, but I'm willing to throw him in a stacking way with Hopkins or on a weird week against a bad secondary. I'm okay with that, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think there's a possible offensive scheme situation to where he could not be great in, but be relevant in terms of fantasy production.
Right.
So I'm definitely okay with him. We kind of gloss over a tight end situation in the passing game. That's just because there really is no tight end situation in Houston. They're one of the few teams that really just has zero options in the game at all.
And they drafted C.J. Fedorowicz a few years ago out of Iowa, but he hasn't really emerged in the passing game. I think he's more of a blocking type, so I don't know that they're really looking for a strong receiving weapon in the tight end position.
No, I don't think so either. And looking at Lamar Miller, obviously, I mean, an uber efficient back, with Miami. The problem was the volume. It just wasn't consistent enough. In looking at his move to Houston, I love to see Lamar Miller at a consistent volume. It doesn't have to be a lot, but just give it to me consistently. I think that's all I'm really asking here because I do like Miller. I think he's in a situation where he can thrive just because there are other weapons around him. He's in a division where he can do some damage in those divisional games. So I'm certainly going to be a believer in Miller, and I think more so in GPPs and just kind of approach it really as the same as I did last year.
Yes, absolutely. Miller is going to be fine. Obviously, signed that nice free agency deal. Should be I'd call him a pseudo feature back where I think he gets 15 to 20 touches a week, but doesn't ever get to sort of that true workhorse type, touches per game. Sort of like I don't think he's going to see 350 touches or anything like that. Nor do I don't need that from him for him to be an every week cash game type guy in that offense. We've seen, I don't think he's going to be like Arian Foster of a few years ago, but I do think he can be sort of in that range. So I could see 1,000 yards. 500 receiving yards. I could see him being the whole package there. And obviously that translates to week production in that offense. So I really like him. The one thing I will say in terms of the backup role, Tyler Irvin is a guy they drafted this year out of a smaller school. Super athletic, super productive in college, and word on the street is that he's been doing really well in training camp. So he's kind of a receiving down back guy that might emerge in a DFS relevant role if Miller were to go down.
Yeah, it's definitely a good point, and I think, the Houston Texans are a team that have begun to use. Obviously they've been put in that point with Foster's injuries over the last few years, but I do think they kind of, will include a running back too in their offense this year, just because I don't see Miller, as you pointed out, not having that full heavy on workload. There's still going to be some potential in behind him kind of cutting into the production a bit.
And just, as we mentioned, it's okay. Not everyone needs to be a 400 carry a season running back to be really fantasy productive. So that's just the type of player he is.
Yeah, definitely. And as far as this defense goes, they were top 10 in the league last year. For me, I still feel like I can pick on the Texans a little bit in different spots. But it's something that has to be with those above average to elite players that you're really going against them with, because it still is a top half defense.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. As you mentioned, some run defenses, you're worried about some running backs against them. But overall for passing game, We know T.Y. Hilton loves to play against them, so that's definitely a matchup to exploit. He's got great splits against them, but even beyond that, some of the shorter, quicker guys definitely eat up their secondary.
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, AFC South overall, it should be one where fantasy points should be flying out, between the division alone and guys playing them.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to wrap it up with the Houston Texans preview. Be sure to check out the rest of our team previews at dailyfantasycafe.com.